Okay, thanks everybody. Welcome, greetings, nice to see you all. This is talk number 6, World War and Working with the God-Intoxicated, 1939 to 1949, and the numbers are pretty flexible. Meher Baba of Ahmednagar and the Aesthetics of Religious Symbolism, and a series of 10 biographical talks. This is number 6. And those of you who, I know there's some of you who have probably not been following these, and you will, I'm going to try and bring everybody up to date, but there are also those of you who have seen the videos. You're going to see a lot of repetition because it is a finite number of pictures, a finite number of, there's a finite amount of material that's relevant to what I want to focus on, so that's repeated. The difference will be that I'm going to talk about this in the context of history of religions rather than the other one, which was more about for people who are actively following Meher Baba. So I'm going to just jump right in. Welcome. Once again, we are faced with the task of understanding Meher Baba's behavior from an objective academic standpoint. By the time of our last talk, we had spoken about Marwan Irani's parents and childhood, his visionary experiences with the controversial Muslim holy woman Hazrat Babajan, as well as his lengthy association with the equally controversial holy man Upasni Maharaj. After leaving the ashram of Upasni Maharaj, Meher Baba left his parents' home and began, of course he was known then as Marwan, but he left his parents' home and began functioning as a controversial spiritual master in his own right, living a small hut in Pune and gathering a small group who began to call Marwan Meher Baba. We also noted that Meher Baba's primary emphasis during this period was on teaching, i.e. on training his disciples, both East and West eventually. His training consisted primarily of, in my, the way I'm kind of zeroing in on it, developing affectional bonds, and that really can't be underestimated because it doesn't sound like teaching or training, but really the central salient feature of everything Meher Baba did throughout his ministry, if we call it a ministry, was the developing of affectional bonds, which means developing attachments to people and with people, and to such a degree that eventually they really didn't care what he said or what he was doing. It's a famous quote of Anita Villard, who Baba was explaining to the ladies in, it may have been Portofino, but it was in Europe somewhere, and he explained that he was the avatar, and this really frustrated and confused Anita, and eventually she said, Baba, I don't care if you're the avatar, I love you anyways. And so this thing of the affectional bonds kind of made people not really worry so much about all the details and all the sort of erratic, apparently arbitrary behavior of Meher Baba. So the other thing he was doing was teaching specifics of cosmology and the spiritual path, including obedience to the master. So this historical trajectory took us up to and through a survey of Meher Baba's first visits to the West, that means Europe and the United States, and took us through some of the sensationalism and controversies that met him on those travels. We also last week surveyed some of our theoretical understandings of Meher Baba up to this point. And just to clarify, this again is an attempt to look at Meher Baba academically from the perspective of history of religions and religious studies, which is using what we call methodological agnosticism, where we don't make a determination what's going on, but we look at a spectrum of possibilities, try to figure out what's the best way to describe this without committing, making a religious commitment on the one hand, or completely scandalizing and trashing somebody on the other hand, saying, oh, it's just, X, Y, Z. So, from that perspective, we concluded, or I concluded, the theoretical approach and sort of the things that we can show academically is to recognize Meher Baba's conviction in the importance of his own early visionary experience, as well as his conviction in the importance of conveying the cosmological and personal significance of this ongoing vision, to communicating it to others. And I say ongoing because his own statements say that he had this visionary experience, and that initial experience for him, he said, was continual, was ongoing. The difference being when he first had the experience, he was unable to connect with and mingle with the gross physical world. Through the work of Upasani Maharaj, he says that he was able to come back into the gross world and operate. And part of what I was speculating about last time, or not the week before, that was that he as he was developing his teachings to his first early disciples, he was also sort of working out for himself the best way to communicate his ideas and his experience to other people. And the core, the germ of what he was communicating seems to be consistent throughout his life, but the way he communicated it and the way he articulated it changed. So, as a result of this visionary experience, and I'm talking here about the experience with Hazrat Babajan and then later with Upasani, Meher Baba maintained a conviction that the ways of the world, the opinions of the world, and the opinions of others were relatively meaningless and unimportant when compared to his own visionary experience of the sacred and the importance of his mission of teaching others about this reality. And I use the word unimportant in a specific way because in his discourse given in the 30s on Maya, he says that the principle of ignorance of Maya causes people to take what is important as unimportant and what is unimportant as important. And his conviction, based on his experience, visionary experience, was that God, which he equates with the truth and he equates with love, they're identical, he says, that is what is important, and that everything else is unimportant, whereas people of the world take everything else that's important, and that as being usually unimportant. So these are the three sort of lenses through which we're understanding Meher Baba. And my own theoretical frame sees Meher Baba's behavior and activities as expressions of the importance of his visionary experience of the sacred. So he had this experience, and all of his behavior and activities are expressions of that original experience. And that these behaviors, though concrete activities, simultaneously communicate symbolically an aesthetic of the sacred that can be both perceived and intuited by most observers. And what I mean by that is that not everyone can see and observe or intuit that he's God in human form or whatever religious claims he makes. But we can see that there's many, many activities he engaged in that were very, very symbolic and resonated, I'm saying, with an aesthetic of the sacred. And as I've explained before, aesthetics is a study of beauty, usually applied to art. In early religious studies and anthropology, when people talked about religion, Fraser, the Golden Bough, and E.B. Tyler, and others, they talk about religion as being a failed science. They put it in the category of science, but it's a science that failed. Doesn't really explain the world the way the world really is. And what I'm saying is that religion, religious practice, religious ideas are much closer to and spring from the same roots as art, and they're much closer to the religious experience. As close to art as a revelation, which one then tries to put into form. And in that sense, when people conceive of the sacred and what is sacred, and when they express it symbolically, there's a particular aesthetic that resonates, and when it resonates in a more universal way, it attracts more people, and it because of the beauty of it, the existential and the aesthetic beauty, they are enlivened by it in the same way a beautiful piece of art would. The difference between art and this kind of aesthetic is that this deals with ultimate concerns rather than just the fleeting ideas of beauty and entertainment and that kind of thing. So that's my long-winded recap of the theoretical frame that we're using for this, so you understand that we're not doing a typical repetition of the religious narrative. The religious narrative is how Meher Baba described his experience, and when a believer comes in and accepts all that, then they tend to talk within that framework. I'm talking from outside that framework, while still trying to be sensitive to, as I said, the aesthetics of that framework. So now we move from Meher Baba's born, has parents, has this strange experience, draws disciples to him. Last time we talked about his visit to the West, and now we're going to talk about he returns from the West. He's going back and forth to the West. All the time he's doing this, World War is brewing, and just as this is beginning to percolate, he begins his work first with the mad and then the God-Intoxicated. So, with all of that under our belt, let's take a deep breath and take a look at another example of Meher Baba's unusual behavior. And it is, even for a religious figure, or we might call an anthropologist, might call him a religious specialist, his work with the musts is not typical of most religious specialists. So, in May 1936, Meher Baba had begun preparations to establish an ashram at Rahuri, a small village some 30 miles from Mehrabad. As he said at the time, since Rahuri is between Mehrabad and Nasik, I can conveniently go to either place from there, and so a small hut in Rahuri should be built for me. And so a small piece of land was acquired there, and huts were built for Baba and some of the Mandali, and eventually they built a whole ashram, a whole little village there of the mad and the people helping Meher Baba work with them. So the development of the Rahuri ashram was to usher in an entirely new phase of Meher Baba's life and work. It proved in fact to be a precursor to his later work with people whom he described as God-Intoxicated, and affectionately he used the Persian word must when he referred to them. And we saw last week with the video, Erich was talking about that, and he said Baba would do this when he was saying that meant must. When he did that, it meant must. And he didn't explain why he did that, but that's what he did. So the years of 1940 to 47 mark a period of extraordinarily intense and focused work on contacting musts, both through the development of must ashrams and through the movement of many, many people through the must tours. There was a period through which they usually called the blue bus tours, and there were many Western women with him and a whole variety of people, but they were primarily for the purpose of contacting musts. Meher Baba said that he saw these activities as an aid to his spiritual work, both the must ashrams and the must tours, and that the musts functioned as vehicles for his work, and we'll talk about that a little later on. This is a picture that I took of Muhammad. It's very sweet. Very grateful for his sweet posing for that picture. He doesn't usually do that. So Meher Baba made a distinction between mad people and musts. Perhaps the easiest way to understand this distinction is to repeat his statement that mind stopped is God, mind working is man, mind slowed down is must, mind working fast is mad. This is just something that Ramju Abdullah overheard Meher Baba say, and he jotted it down, thankfully. So Meher Baba also made distinctions that are considerably more nuanced. For example, another way of understanding this distinction between the musts can be found in a quote we read during a previous talk. It was also in the film, and the videos that, by the way, the videos, hope within a week or so will be online. Yes? Yeah. If it works, if technology cooperates. So if you missed the must videos, we'll still have some of that. So this is something that Meher Baba says, and I think this is very, very important. It's really, to me, a key, and to me, the two discourses in the beginning of The Wayfarers, written by Meher Baba, really should be in the main 3 volumes of the discourses, or the other volumes, because, and not that they shouldn't be they should be in The Wayfarers as well, but they really underline so much in Meher Baba's work, and this is one key thing which I'll read now. So this is Meher Baba in this discourse. According to one way of interpretation, madness is a deviation from the average mode of consciousness and behavior. So we have an average, that means what we call normal. It's a level that once you've developed to a certain state, you're like everybody else. You respond to things culturally and conversationally and otherwise on the level of the average. Its degree is to be measured by the amount of its departure from the average pattern. In other words, the level of consciousness and behavior isn't whether you're super conscious or don't have much consciousness. It's just how close you are to the way everybody else is. But according to another way of interpretation, madness is the incapacity of consciousness to understand or express truth. So first of all, of course, you have to have some way to determine what truth is. In this case, we're going by what Mayor Baba says. But this is a whole different way of measuring where someone is in relation to madness. So its degree is to be measured by the extent to which it deviates from truth. So in other words, the more someone deviates from truth is how mad they are. So that means there's truth up here, there's the average down here, and Mayor Baba says from the point of view of truth, the average is madness. And of course what we call madness, someone who can't quite make it up to the average level, is even more mad than the average. But from the level of truth, the average is madness. So this is a framework with which to understand. This is the way Mayor Baba understands his work and the way he understands the musts, and it's the mean by which he measures, not that he judges or measures people, but it's the mean by which he judges, you could say judges his own behavior or applies deliberation. It's always how close is what's going on to truth, which is very different from how close is it to the average. So, as I was saying in the previous talk, what appears to be, for Mayor Baba, his visionary experience is absolutely true and is in complete alignment with the divine, the sacred, what is true, and with love. And when things are in line with that, he just goes forward. To someone who's average, like most of us, that seems to be often arbitrary, erratic, and for some people, it seems like he's just crazy. I mean, what in the world, why would anybody do that? Well, he says it's because he's closer to that higher norm of truth. So, getting back to the ideas of must ashrams and must tours, according to Dr. Donkin, author of the main book documenting Mayor Baba's work with musts, The Wayfarers, Mayor Baba's typical work with a must at an ashram was to shave, bathe, clothe, and feed each inmate as soon as he arrived, and each day to scour the ashram latrine, and to bathe and sit in seclusion with a certain number of old inmates. In this way, he would throw every ounce of energy into doing every sort of menial task. So remember Mayor Baba saying that this is closer to truth, closer to love, than the average, which would be, I'm not cleaning the retreat, no way. So it seemed that Mayor Baba's purpose was to put each must in a relaxed, happy, and receptive mood. And Donkin, there's several quotes here from Donkin where Mayor Baba had communicated this to him. So for some spiritual reasons of his own, Baba insists that the slightest whim of a must should be fulfilled. And these are the page numbers where this appears in the Wayfarers. Another quote, on the evidence of Baba's own statement, we have learned that a must's moods have an important bearing on his usefulness for Baba's work. And the final quote, Baba has stressed that he must fulfill the slightest whim of a must, and that if he fails to do this, the rapport is vitiated by an irritability on the part of the must, who feels his wish to have been frustrated. In this way, musts, like children, have the most inconsequent fancies and become upset if these are thwarted. So, Mayor Baba's work is primarily to get the must in that good mood. And Donkin says, indeed, there is nothing that makes Baba so really happy as a first-rate must in a first-rate mood. And it looks like he's achieved that with Muhammad here. This is a very young Muhammad. Could be Rahuri. He looks young enough to be Rahuri. It might be a later ashram. So, when on a must tour, Baba's emphasis was similar, but was more focused on the act of contacting the must. To this end, Mayor Baba and his Mandali went through untold hardships and privations, traveling over 75,000 miles and making approximately 20,000 contacts during the years of 1940 through 1946. It's a lot of traveling, and by all reports, it was no picnic. I'm sure there are many stories of hardship, but the one that really sticks with me is these European ladies sitting in the back. In the front is Guy Mai, Erich's mother, with Erich's brother Merwan, and Merwan needs to pee, needs to urinate, and they can't stop. Oh no, we got to get there. Very important that we go. So he says, just hold him out the window. So he holds Merwan, little Merwan, who Baba a couple times said was a saint, holds little baby Merwan out the window, and he pees out the window and spraying all the European ladies in the back as the window. So for some people that wouldn't be the worst thing, but for these ladies, I think this was really, you had to hope that their affectional bonds with Meher Baba had been very strong. So according to Duncan's report, throughout all these hardships, Baba remained the freshest of all, and after each contact with a really good must, he seemed particularly radiant, as if some great work had been achieved or some heavy burden lifted. So, what did Meher Baba do when he contacted a must? According to Duncan, he typically did three things. He feeds him, he gives him a metal coin, and he sits with him in a secluded place where no one sees this silent conference. Since observing silence, Baba has not touched money except when he gives it to musts, salik like pilgrims, sadhus, and the poor. This giving of money is fundamentally not charity, but is a medium of contact. And Baba, particularly with musts, uses metal coins. He has explained that the metal in some specific way acts as a medium of contact. Those who go on a must tour with Baba are often painfully aware of this necessity for metal coins, where their arms and fingers ache from carrying a heavy bag of coins of all denominations. And this is one of the musts in the Wayfarers. There's one of these, one of the maps. There's a map for every one of these years from 1940 through 1946 with varying numbers, 18,800 miles, 50,000 miles, and a number of how many must, sadhus, and poor were contacted. So this work with the musts, whatever it may be, was as intense as it was inexplicable to the casual observer. Thousands of miles to contact people who, by any cultural norms, would be considered hopelessly mentally unbalanced. Can there be irrational explanations for this behavior, this intense interest in contacting apparently people who are apparently mad? The accepted religious explanation is that these individuals are closer to God than the average, and because of this, they help Meher Baba in his spiritual work. So according to this religious explanation, which we got into a little bit earlier with the idea of the median being the average, and then the people falling below it being mad, and people above it being musts, even if they do not behave in the way that would even be up to the average in terms of cultural norms and all that. They are higher than the average because of their proximity or their expression or their ability to be conscious of truth and love and all that moves closer and closer to what Meher Baba claims in his visionary experience was the ultimate manifestation of the divine. So according to this religious explanation, musts can be of great spiritual help to aspirants as well as to the spiritual master. And regarding to helping aspirants, Meher Baba explains, in spite of the fact that many musts lose their balance while traversing the path of the inner life, they are often capable of rendering effective service to other aspirants less advanced than themselves. Musts are completely oblivious of worldly considerations and values, but they are very sensitive to the spiritual needs of those who come in touch with them. Musts, because they are consciously stationed on the higher planes, can give to aspirants just that type of occult help that is necessary. In regard to being of help to the master, that was how they helped the aspirants. This is how they helped the master. Meher Baba says, because of his being stationed on the inner planes, which are free from the limitations and handicaps of the gross world, a must can be, and often is, in contact with a far greater number of souls than is possible for an ordinary person. Must mind is a nucleus of conscious formations with innumerable and far-reaching links. A must can therefore be a more effective agent for spiritual work than the most able persons of the gross world. The must mind is also often used directly by the master as a medium for sending his spiritual help to different parts of the world. Very often, when the master is helping a must, he is also helping the world through him at that very time. When a must thus surrenders his mind for the work of the master, he is in fact getting closer to the master as truth. He is being perfected far more rapidly than would have been the case if he had avoided such surrender. So what we have to ask ourselves is, how can this be possible for someone who is on the average, where we are not conversant with the mysteries of that Meher Baba is describing, and for most people this is just going to sound, for most people, not certainly you require some intuition to have any sense of what Meher Baba is doing. You also have to have a sense, I think, of the what I'm calling the aesthetics of the sacred. That's the whole reason I frame this around the aesthetics of the sacred, is that if you don't have a sensitivity to that on an aesthetic level, or on an intuitive level, it's going to be very difficult to understand. And this is a place where, particularly if we just talk to average people matter-of-factly, that, well, this is just the way it is, people lose the thread and are kind of lose interest in what you're saying. So it's important to try, for me, it's important to try and find a way, a lens through which you can talk about this. Now, when I read what Meher Baba is saying, I'm reading what we call in religious studies the religious narrative. This is the narrative, this is the story that believers tell to others to explain why things work. And usually believers say this with a conviction born out of experience of some kind, whereas people who have not got the same conviction are not necessarily going to leap right in and be able to certainly to agree with all that. So this is Meher Baba explaining why it would be possible for a must who surrenders his mind to the master for his work is able to somehow help people at a far distance more rapidly than other people. So Meher Baba says, this is from his discourses, those who have even a preliminary acquaintance with the structure and laws of the inner spheres of existence know that complete isolation of human beings is a figment of imagination. The gross world as a vehicle of spiritual life has its own indubitable importance, but the links and connections existing between different persons can by no means be fully estimated if we merely consider the tangible transactions which take place in the gross world. So granted, this excerpt from the religious narrative will not be convincing to everyone. Given that, how then are we to interpret these mysterious activities? Should we surmise, as some might, that Meher never really recovered from his bout with mental illness at the age of 19? Is he still simply acting out a repetition compulsion of his own earlier traumatic experience? He went through a time when everybody, except perhaps his father, thought that he had lost his mind. There's a story, which I've told here a couple times, where Gai Mai, who Meher Baba later said was his spiritual mother, first trip to Upasi Maharaj's ashram, and Meher is there, and someone says to her, do you know Meher? Do you know? No. He said, do you know Shariar, his Shariarji? And she said, oh yeah, he's a distant cousin, he was at my wedding, there's some relation there. And Shit, but didn't his son go insane? This is Gulmai, Adi's mother. So the whole community, everyone there assumed that Meher Baba was insane. So he got little sympathy from people when he was in this state, and an objective, psychologically oriented person might say, well, he's acting out of repetition compulsion, he's seeking out other people who are insane and giving them the kind of love that he didn't get. Is that what he's doing? If so, why are his explanations so intelligently articulated, so well thought out? They're really quite unique. And Carl Ernst, I didn't include this quote here, but Carl Ernst in his book on Sufism says that it's unique in the history of religions, and he's considered an expert not only in Islam, but in Sufism and in the realm where this whole idea of God-Intoxication, the whole word must, comes from that realm. And he says there's nowhere else in the history of religions, certainly in the history of Islam or Sufism, where anybody so articulately and in such depth does this kind of work or has these kind of explanations. So where does that come from? Does that come with, it poses real questions for someone who tries to use that explanation. My claim is that they're not only intelligently articulated, but they're very aesthetically pleasing. They have this aesthetic of the sacred to them. They have this symbolism to them that is even if you have no idea, believe me, I have no idea what he's doing, I find it very pleasing. I find the stories of the must, I find the loving engagement, and also the pictures and the way they, this guy is certainly happy to have Meher Baba bow down to him. There's just an aesthetic to that does not require intellectual engagement, but is quite pleasing. That's all I can say about it. So it is also interesting to note, I'm not trying to make any connection, just to say that the world was being torn apart by war as all of this was happening. According to Donkin, the Must tours themselves were not unlike being involved in a military campaign. Whether in the Must ashrams or on tour, the pace was often exhausting, requiring a constant vigilance that could, as Donkin describes, this is from The Wayfarers, could produce a sense of stress and demand a power of adaptability not unlike that needed in war. One must be ready at any hour of the day or night to go into action at a word from Baba or to change one's plans to meet a new situation. And I will not do this here. It wouldn't be appropriate in this kind of presentation, and I haven't done the research. But I don't know if you know Bob Fredericks. He's doing he's done a series of little video movies, a lot of interviews, and movies that he's put together, and he's putting together a movie that sort of parallels what Meher Baba was doing with exactly what was happening in the war at that time. And people I've spoken to, he did a presentation at the Avataric Legacy program in Mehrabad this year in February, and people who saw it said it was quite engaging. So another aspect of this work is the context in which it took place. In colonial British India, while war was intensifying in Europe, Meher Baba traveled under warlike conditions, seeking out people who, like himself at one time earlier in his life, like him, were considered to be unbalanced and out of step with the culture, even though the culture itself seemed to be expressing a much more terrible form of madness. And you can kind of starkly see here where the average norm was that everybody was at war, but clearly that was not, certainly not as highly in touch with those values and principles of truth and love and what we usually associate with divinity or with God. Clearly everyone, even people who aren't very religious, will emphasize that this is not close to any of those values. So, Meher Baba's quest for apparently mad people who, according to Meher Baba, were actually divinely absorbed is a fascinating symbolic act in itself. This is my claim about it. To do so while the whole world was descending into the chaotic, murderous madness of a devastating world war for the sole purpose of lovingly caring for the poor, the ascetics, the divinely mad, is one example of what I mean by the aesthetics of religious symbolism. When we see it up close, it has that aesthetic of religious symbolism, but when we see it, when we step back and see it in the whole context, it's even more stark and impressive. So, whatever the physical or metaphysical reality being enacted by Meher Baba in this work of personal service that he vigorously performed for these men and women for several decades, the symbolic impression created by the juxtaposition of cultural realities and religious narrative creates an aesthetic that can be quite palpable to the observer. Whether one considers Meher Baba to be an unbalanced person indulging in an erratic series of religious fantasies, or a realized being working in invisible realms for the betterment of humankind, when considered from the perspective of an aesthetic of the sacred, he is by any measure a fascinating individual.